Now, many of you may remember many years ago, I think it was back in 1988, there was a movie made from a book titled The Last Temptation of Christ. Does anybody remember that movie? There's a few. And if you remember, there was quite a bit of ruckus particularly down where I lived at the time, Texas, Oklahoma, especially among evangelicals about the movie's portrayal of Jesus. And the premise of the book, The Last Temptation of Christ, is simply that last temptation of Christ is an invitation for Jesus to come down from the cross and just live a normal human life, which means marriage and family. It also portrayed him as being a rather sometimes unconfident, sometimes struggling with his own sense of call. But the controversy really was actually about portraying Jesus as having marital relations with his wife. Not a surprise down south in the Bible Belt. Many conservative Christians found this too much, which, I don't know if y'all ever heard this, which led to protests at movie theaters. And even on occasions, the slashing of movie screens. Anybody ever hear of this? Y'all are so safe here in Iowa, I swear. I remember I went and there's people protesting the movie. And I remember going to see the movie. It was all right. And there were security guards sitting in the back to prevent people from slashing the screen. And I remember thinking to myself, these poor guys have to sit through this movie over and over and over again. But I remember being struck by this very scandal of an idea that Christians had that would portray Jesus as being so human. And this kind of bothers me somewhat, and because in many ways one of the central theological assertions of the church, of people of faith, is Jesus was fully divine and fully human. We're more comfortable with the divine part. We're not so sure we're comfortable with the human part. Yet somehow it's wrong. Somehow to emphasize Jesus' humanity is to almost make him somehow seem less than he is. As if being human is something dirty or wrong. Yet, Jesus was profoundly human. His humanity leaks through any of the stories of the Gospels that you might read. We see him get angry and frustrated. We see him overwhelmed and a need to go off by himself into the wilderness. And we might find it odd to think that Jesus laughed and cried and felt joy and felt sorrow, but he experienced the whole gamut of human existence. Or otherwise, he would not have been fully human. So you may be surprised for me to say, Jesus was anxious. To be human is to experience anxiety. Now, many scientists, psychologists argue that anxiety is really what it is a response to an unknown or a response to an anticipated threat that was really necessary for our survival as a species. It made us more hyper-aware of the possibility of a lion hiding in the grass, right? Now, yet in our modern world, amidst its own stresses and anxieties, this human capacity, this human survival tool might literally be driving us crazy. Anxiety disorders, which are defined as the sense in which everybody experiences anxiety, but when the anxiety interferes with the natural living of our life, the natural enjoyment of living of our life, that's when we're having more profound struggles, and almost every person here has experienced those moments. But those those are the number one mental disorders affecting the adult population 18 and older. About 40 million people, or about 19% of the adult population. And as we know, the years of COVID only exacerbated our anxiety. Who wouldn't be anxious, right? Especially how it impacted our lives. And it's particularly impacted, and they're seeing more and more. In fact, there is now a trend for your family doctor to screen you when you go for your checkup. Your family doctor more and more will be screening you for anxiety. And it's particularly true among our younger generations. The crisis, the stresses, the significant stressors and the significant anxieties of economic struggles, of the politics of our time, of climate change. Our anxiety just seems to be rising and rising and rising. Now, I found this interesting. There was a recent survey by the American Psychological Association who pointed out that one of the things shared by both Republicans and Democrats is how highly anxious they are about the election. That's kind of funny how we share that anxiety, convinced the world is about to end, whichever side we're on. Everything makes us anxious. To be human is to be anxious. In the familiar story that we read this morning, Jesus, hours before his arrest, hours before he will be taken in and eventually persecuted, he goes to be in the Garden of Gethsemane to pray with his disciples. It's a powerful image if you look at it and hear it and read it, a powerful image of a man under incredible stress. He knows the writing on the wall. He senses what is about to happen, and he is fearful, and he is anxious. And so he does what we often do. He begs God, save me. And yet, seemingly in the next breath, affirms his trust in God. And in the very next line, I don't know if you notice this, it's an odd line. It says, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Did you know there is actually a medical condition where you will sweat blood? And they find it among people under incredible stress and anxiety. There is no avoiding this image of Jesus, the human being, struggling with anxiety and fear. So it is one of the scandals of the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. It is one of the scandals that, in a way, what God does in Jesus is affirm, not deny, our humanity. That in a sense, God embraces our humanness. Embraces that in Jesus as he experiences fears and anxieties and as he struggles. So let me put it this way. We are not broken because we are anxious. We are simply human. I think that's important to say in part because we often tie ourselves in knots about our anxieties. You know, it's such a human thing to be anxious about being anxious, right? Happens to us all the time. And the truth is, sometimes we are being anxious for very real reasons, losses of jobs and family struggles, those kinds of things, but that's part of being human. And we judge ourselves as if being anxious, we've done something wrong, as if we are not being good enough or faithful enough and we have the anxiety. So the humanity of Jesus' story this morning reminds us of God's grace. That God's grace accepts us all, even in the midst of our anxieties and fears. God's grace embraces us. And then, as I think about it, there's the prayer Jesus says, "Take this cup from me." And then, as I said, seemingly in the next breath, "Not my will, but your will." And I suspect that we've kind of shortened the timeline of that in the story, just so we can, really there was a lot more space between his asking God, "Please take this from me. I can't do this. I can't keep up with this. I'm hurting too much. I'm too afraid. I'm too anxious," to that moment when he simply says, "Not my will, but your will." I suspect that moment from intercession to acceptance really took all night. It reflects our own inner struggles, the anxious conversations in our own heads, moving back and forth between worry and letting go. But I like that line, "Not my will, but your will," is a kind of prayer of trust. Now, it's not a rote formula that removes our fear and anxieties. It's not as if we're saying some magical words that we won't feel anxiety. It's not as if we have to say those magic words and our anxieties are gone, because that's not true. But it is a willingness, I think, to let go and to trust God is at work, whether that's in our own lives or in the world. It is a path, it is a prayer of trust where we're not trapped in that struggle in our heads, but find a path, maybe of stillness and peace amidst the struggle. Now, how many of you noticed that there's a line in that text in which it said, "And an angel came and strengthened him"? What's interesting about that, this is even before that line, "the angel came and strengthened him," is right before it describes him as sweating blood. So I find it confusing that an angel came and strengthened him, but it occurs to me that all of us in the midst of our own anxieties and fears need the angels who come to strengthen us, right? Doesn't get rid of our anxiety and fears, but an anxiety and fear shared is one that can be borne in meaningful and powerful ways. That in many ways, part of the reason Jesus could have gone in the Garden of Gethsemane by himself, heck, the disciples just were stumbling all over themselves, failing to be present to him, yet he needed them there while he prayed. He needed other human beings to share in his anxious struggle. And the truth is that for us, as we wrestle with our own stresses and anxieties and fears, need each other. We need to be angels to each other. To not get rid of people's anxieties and fears, not to fix it, guys. We're often famous at fixing things, right? Trying to fix things. More importantly, to help console and be present. And in that way, we can know God's presence in each other. So this morning, Susan's going to help me as we sing the hymn this morning, "Jesus, Healer of Every Ill." The worship committee has gotten some hearts, and they're going to be able to fit in your pocket, and we're going to ask you to take one, to come forward and take one. And the reason is we want you, it may be that you want to hold someone you know who's wrestling with some pretty significant struggles, someone who you know might be might be highly anxious or depressed or struggling with addiction. But what we would like for you to do is take this heart and hold it in your pocket to remind you to hold them in your heart, to lift them up. It may even be that you will be holding that heart for yourself, and to trust and lift up to God those who you yourself or others may be struggling. So let us stand and sing the hymn. As we do so, Susan's going to be up here, and please come down the center aisle. Come on, Susan, and take a heart.